Our next speaker is personally, I'm a great fan of him, and talking about strong opinions and having them weakly or changing one's mind according to the evidence. There is one of the most remarkable examples is Mr. Mark Lynas, who is our next speaker, and he's going to talk to us about anti-science and populism. So please, Mark, welcome.
Can you turn off the screen?
Yeah, I try to. Do you need microphone or? No. Okay, please.
Is this one for the phone?
Yeah, that's one there, somewhere there.
Thanks, Harry. Actually, there's one issue that I've not changed my mind on, and that issue is the one that I've been writing about my whole professional life, and which only yesterday I just made the start on a new book about, and that's the issue of climate change. So I began my environmentalist career, perhaps, straight out of university. By that point, I was already quite interested in global warming. In fact, even when I was a high school student at the age of 15, I wrote a dissertation on global warming, the greenhouse effect, as it was called then. And when I left university, I went straight into the activist movement at quite a radical level, you could say. So I was working with Earth First and other grassroots groups. And, you know, we did some fairly heavy stuff. You know, we set things on fire. You know, we had a philosophy which, while it didn't accept harm to animals or humans, really had no concern about destruction of property. Particularly if that property was being used, as we saw it, in ways which harmed the interests of Mother Earth. We had a phrase for Earth First: no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. And we took that phrase very literally, and we took it very seriously. And one of the types of property which I was personally involved in destroying was genetically modified crops. And it's interesting seeing some of the early speakers today, because it really brings back to me what it was that we objected to. And it was something to do with the idea that modern technologies were intruding into the realm of, I wouldn't say God, because we weren't religious believers, but it certainly was the same part of the brain as you have for religion. So it felt to us like it was an invasion of the sacred with impurities of modern technologies, modern life. And for us, of course, the solution was to go backwards to an era when life was more pure. And organic as a concept, I think, appeals exclusively to this idea of an idyllic past, before our lives were polluted with technologies and with artificiality. And you see this with people's concerns about chemicals and radiation, and pretty much all of the issues that we can debate and where people get the science wrong is because it appeals intuitively to a sense of rejection, a sense of abhorrence. I would probably also extend that to insects. Some of the most persistent anti-GMO myths that I've seen are about insect genes, or arachnid genes, scorpion genes, whatever, being inserted into your food. And that therefore gives people this yuck factor, this sense that, oh, you know, you saw the picture, oh, I don't want that, I don't want to eat that, I don't want that to have anything to do with me. And so we used to go out into the fields in the night, armed with machetes, and destroy them. And we were very successful in doing that. By the year 2000 or so in the UK, we destroyed every single GMO test site. We closed down the whole scientific enterprise. Every single university department, every single laboratory that was testing these crops was targeted or was forced to stop its research. And we also exported that religious moral fervour to the rest of the world, to Asia, to India, to Africa, even more recently to the United States and to elsewhere across the Americas. And I think you could say, looking back in retrospect, that the anti-GMO opinion has become perhaps the most widely believed conspiracy theory in the world today. In China, for example, I saw some of the recent polling data. If you extrapolate it out, 150 million people believe that GM soya has been invented by the United States in order to stop China taking over as a superpower by polluting the Chinese or somehow stopping the ability to reproduce, which is kind of a joke because they were the ones who had the one-child policy. But none of this is logical. I've seen the same in Africa, and these myths are very culturally specific. One of the things that I was quite shocked to see in Africa was the myth that GMO crops had gay genes in that would cause your children to become homosexual. And this was, again, for many African countries where there's this very persistent homophobia, that's something which evokes a lot of shock and anger and rage. And of course it comes with this idea of westernization, that somehow like homosexuality is a foreign import, somehow threatening to the traditional sense of African culture and identity. So all of these issues, all of these very deep values issues are mixed up in these kinds of debates. And it's very difficult to get around it. So even when you can think of an example of a GMO crop which addresses every single argument that's been made against it. So it's, people are concerned about Monsanto, or they're concerned about more chemicals, or they're concerned about farmers being able to save seeds. How many times have we, those of us who've been involved in this debate, heard those kinds of arguments? And you could say, okay, I will give you the example of BT eggplant in Bangladesh. Okay, it's not made by Monsanto. It's been developed in the public sector with philanthropic funding. It's owned in the public sector. It's being given to the farmers, some of the poorer farmers in the world who only cultivate very small areas, in order that they can drastically reduce the insecticide sprays they use because it has a pest-resistant trait. And the seeds are being given out for free. And the farmers can cultivate it, they can save the seeds, they can share it with their brothers, their sisters, their neighbours, and the seeds then can be spread throughout the region. So what remaining objections do you, Mr. or Mrs. Anti-GMO activist, have to this technology? Well, they'll think of one. In fact, they will just repeat most of the same objections that they had originally. Oh, this is increasing pesticides. This is taking away the farmer's ability to save seeds. This is somehow some distant relationship to Monsanto. Surely it has to be a Trojan horse for Monsanto because all GMOs are. And I've personally traveled into at least 5 different provinces of Bangladesh over several years and met many of the farmers who are cultivating GMO eggplant. I've sliced it up, fried it in turmeric, eaten it, tastes the same as any other eggplant, which is for me, in turmeric with a bit of curry, it's a beautiful thing, really nice, and a very important culinary vegetable in Bangladesh. But what struck me most of all was farmers telling me stories about how anti-GMO activists had already been there every time I arrived at a farm, and they told these farmers that if you grow the GMO crop, it will make your children turn paralyzed. They will, right? And the farmers would say to them, well, what should we do instead? And the environmentalists would say, you must carry on spraying pesticides. Right? These are people who are funded by the organic movement in Europe. They are supported by Greenpeace. They are invited to agroecological conferences around the world, and they're going to farmers in Bangladesh saying you must spray more pesticides. Because that is the depth and the level of their objection to this hideous intrusion into the realm of purity, which is the GMO. And I have a fairly unique personal story on this issue in that I started off destroying the crops, and now I'm out there defending them. So I've kind of gone very much full circle. I'm going to Tanzania in a couple of weeks to a central part of Tanzania called Dodoma, where there's a confined field trial of the latest drought-resistant and pest-resistant maize. So again, a very important, this is work which is supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So it's again kind of philanthropic, although the technology actually was originated by Monsanto and donated to the project. So you can make the link to Monsanto. But this, you would think, would be a fantastic innovation for farmers, because these are parts of sub-Saharan Africa which are already experiencing the first impacts of climate change, particularly in terms of drought and more irregular rainfall and so on, and where you've got very high rates of malnutrition still, thanks to poverty, but also thanks to the very low productivity that subsistence agricultural systems have in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can walk around the fields and they just look crap. You've got, little corn plants, not very high, very low production. You can open up the ears and there's really very little there, because not just because they lack modern varieties, hybrid varieties, but they lack fertilizer, the soils are very poor, they lack all of the different technologies which farmers now take for granted across most of the rest of the world. And so they produce 10th or 20th of what you'd get from an industrialized agricultural system. And that, of course, leads to a structural food insecurity situation. And so at the field trial, we'll be bringing in journalists to show them actually this is what a GMO looks like. It doesn't have big teeth. It's not something which is going to poison your children or turn them gay or whatever it is that you're concerned about. This is just a normal maize crop which happens to grow better in a dry year and has a pest-resistant trait, so you don't need to spray it. And one of the things that struck me last time I was there was that they have all these regulations about biosafety. So even though all the scientists will tell you that genetically modified crops are exactly as safe as any other, they have all these biosafety regulations which mean that you have to have a very high fence, you all have to wear this kind of protective gear. It's a bit like visiting a nuclear power plant. It gives a very bad visual impression that there's something scary is going on behind that fence. The scientists are doing something weird in the laboratory. And the rules mean that after the field trial test is completed, everything that's produced on that site must be burned. So they take all this, and the last round of the test had about 2 or 3 tons of maize. And everyone around, all of the farms around people were hungry, really desperately hungry, because it was a bad drought situation. And they could see the smoke from burning all of this maize. And for me, that kind of symbolized the absurdity of regulations which are not science-based, and which are not based on any real sense of risk, but are based on ideas of purity and precaution, which originally were exported from the developed world 15, 20 years ago when they first made these international rules in the Cartagena Protocol, and they claimed it was to protect biodiversity and so on and so forth. All these things are harming the interests of some of the poorest farmers in the world, and they're defended by some of the richest people in the world on the basis that they're somehow protecting the environment or protecting poorer farmers. And these discussions are not had in a scientific level, and I think that's important to realize. And you could say, well, I have a science-based perspective, but that's not the issue. The issue is politics. And so the activist groups in all of these countries, the development groups, the groups that claim to be opposing poverty, talk about a concept of food sovereignty, right? Whereas the development, the kind of pro-science side, talks about food security. Now, food security isn't something you can measure empirically. You can measure how much calories people have access to on average, what the rates of malnutrition are for children up the age of 5, things like that. Now, food sovereignty is a political concept, and that's about the idea of food should be produced in the locality, ownership of seeds, ownership of the food system itself, needing to keep out multinationals, capitalism, things like that. And so you can find yourself having very parallel debates about more or less the same thing. because people see them through different frames. And this brings me back to the issue of climate change, which is what I've spent most of my time on. The book that I've now started writing yesterday is the second updated edition of 6 Degrees, which I first published back in 2007 and had a degree-by-degree picture of what happens to the planet as it warms up, which is based on a very big literature survey, which had taken me two or 3 years to do in the past. It's been quicker this time. I've been able to go through even though there's a lot more out there in the scientific literature, it's much easier to get to now. There's better search functions. The journals are all published online, which wasn't the case when I was working back in the early 2000s. And this is kind of in response to, I get emails almost every day, people saying, have you updated 6 Degrees? Is it still relevant? What's going to happen? People want to have a view into the future, which you can get using scientific tools, models, projections, paleoclimate, this kind of stuff. But for me, my consistency on climate change, because I consider that to be a scientifically informed position, I use to explain my inconsistency on the GMO issue, right? So what I mean by that is that I defend the science of climate change because I believe there to be a scientific consensus that global warming is happening. Obviously, there's huge amounts of evidence out there, and there's different ways to look at it. You can say, well, all of the national academies make these statements saying that global warming is real and caused by humans. Or perhaps you will look at the quantification study that was performed and came out with a 97% of all of the papers published agreed with the idea that humans are changing the climate. And I believe that's real and that's a very meaningful way. Otherwise, if you don't believe in scientific consensus, then you can just cherry pick. You can say, okay, here's a study published in a journal which says that sunspots are causing global warming, or here's a study showing that the ice actually isn't melting, or here's a study showing that somewhere in the atmosphere temperatures aren't rising, or whatever it happens to be. And that's pretty much what climate skeptics do. So they pick the 3% and they exaggerate them and they say, look, the paradigm is wrong. But then if you contrast that with the GMO issue, the same level of scientific consensus, I believe, exists at least on the safety. So all of the environmental groups out there saying it's unproven, it's unsafe, we need to be precautioned, it could have some bad impact on human health, is for me in the same camp as the climate change deniers. They may have different politics. Mostly it's the right wing who are disbelieving the science on climate change, and mostly it's the left wing who are disbelieving the science on GMOs. But if you're going to be science-based, as ecomodernists are, I think, you have to accept the science on both those issues. Yes, you can be critical, and yes, there's political debates about all those different things. So on climate change, for example, you can accept the science on the causes of climate change and maybe accept the science on the likely impacts. But when it comes to mitigation, well, you can have a huge debate about that. Do we need nuclear? Do we need more renewables? Do we need better integration? Do we need efficiency? All of those things are perfectly legitimate subjects for debate. And the same goes on GMOs. Who does own the seeds? Whose interests are these technologies being developed in? Those are legitimate debates. But they shouldn't be used as a fig leaf to defend anti-scientific or pre-scientific notions of vitalism or purity, which really are about the essence of the sort of the conventional environmentalist belief. And I think the same does apply to climate change, actually. So whereas with GMOs, the belief is that there was an idyllic past where everyone was happy and where everyone was eating organic, and we should go back to that. So they say to farmers, you can just give up pesticides. You can have all these original farmer-saved seeds, which don't have modern varieties. Forget about hybrids. Give up fertilizer. You don't need any extra nitrogen. You can get it from just, from wishful thinking, essentially. And so they contrast that with the reality, so they can avoid ever talking about the real-world trade-offs. And the real-world trade-offs with turning the world organic is that you would need to at least double the land area which is cultivated. If you double the land area cultivated, that means you have to halve the amount of natural land which remains. That means you have to destroy most of the rainforest, most of the wetlands. You have to worsen the biodiversity crisis. So when you start to accept the trade-offs, then you get into a situation where you say, okay, well, maybe organic, although it can have some very useful lessons, and there's some very useful techniques which have been developed as part of organic, as a global solution, it isn't going to work. It's actually going to make things worse, either climate, biodiversity, and of course, the wider issue of food security generally. And I think the same kind of issue comes in with energy, actually, that this idea of an all renewable green future where everything's sort of happening at the small scale and it's all to do with renewable flows is very similar to this idea of the purity of pre-industrial agriculture. I think it's a myth. I don't think it's achievable, and I therefore think it's important to challenge these kinds of belief systems. I mean, it sort of is logical that you can't solve the problems of today or tomorrow with the technologies of yesterday. And yet, that's the intuition that people are very susceptible to. And I'll just finish by mentioning how much more polarized and divisive these issues all seem to be now than they were when I started out in the 2000s, in the era before social media and before the internet. So when I started writing 6 Degrees, in fact, when I started my first climate book, which was back in 2000, called High Tide, I actually had to go into a library and I had to go along the shelves. They were using the Dewey Decimal System and I had to look at 1.044. You wouldn't know any of this because most of you who are younger never use hard copies of anything, right? But they actually had journals bound into books, covered in dust. No one ever looked at them, and I had to get these things out of the shelf and look at them physically in a library. That's how different it was. And so that's important because that was I could only do that because I had access to the library, and it put me in a sort of elite position, if you like, as almost like an expert. Nowadays, everyone's an expert. Everyone has access to huge amounts of information. Everyone's sharing huge amounts of information, and you don't have the gatekeepers anymore at really any level. I'm not just talking about scientific debates, which structure information, make it meaningful, and filter information in a way which tells people what is more authoritative than something else. And so you have this very horizontal sort of informational landscape now, which I think is much more democratic, but has also allowed the rise of populism, which I think is largely a result of the social media age. There was other things going on there too: the financial crash, inequalities, mass immigration, things like that. But all of those things have happened before. I think what's different today is about mass access to media, and populism, I think, is a threat to both wider democracy and to the scientific method as we've known it. The idea of science has always been that you need some level of authoritative gatekeeping, the peer review process, the top level journals, things like that. So it has the pure idea of science of it just being about performing experiments, empiricism, objective data. While that's true, who decides what's a good experiment has been about peer review. So expertise is a absolutely essential part of the idea of the modern scientific method. Yet expertise has gone out of the window because that's now an elite concept. So today we have the populist idea is that everybody's opinion is equally valid. But it isn't really if you accept that expertise counts. If you know what the fuck you're talking about, right? And people know this intuitively as well. You don't go for heart surgery from a taxi driver. You don't ask a podiatrist to fly an aeroplane. Expertise obviously matters. We accept this in every single area. But if it's something which appeals to some sort of level of intuition, like, I don't like that GMO or I don't like that nuclear power plant or something, then everyone's expertise becomes more valid because it's something we want to believe. And I think the kind of the autocrats, like our next door neighbor Vladimir Putin, have realized the opportunity this gives to anti-democratic forces by corroding trust in institutions, democratic institutions, sources of conventional authority, like the scientific institutions as well. So whilst everything gets leveled down and brought to a more democratic horizontal landscape, who's coming up with the rise of populism? It's not experts. It's people who give you easy answers, which are misinformed and which will lead to worse social and environmental outcomes. And so I kind of see the battles that I've been involved in on climate and on GMOs and in nuclear as part of this wider fight that we're involved in to defend the concepts of truth, and also to defend the concepts of the political concepts of democracy themselves in the modern era from all of the challenges that are going on. And I think ecomodernism is on the right side of those arguments, but those arguments are continuing all the time, and we all have to be involved on a day-to-day basis, because of course there's nothing less than our children's future, and the future of the planet is absolutely at stake here. Thank you very much. Now, I've left quite a long time for discussion, because I assume some of these issues are controversial, but maybe...
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I was thinking about, you talked a lot about the attitudes against GMOs in the Western world, or the richer part of the world, and the poorer part of the world. And I was thinking that while I and many who I know worry about the influence that Europe, for instance, has on Africa, and in telling them basically not to use GMOs and these kind of strange statements, I was thinking that in these, when you travel to Bangladesh or Africa, there you have the pre-industrial agriculture, so to say, and you have a lot more people involved in subsistence farming and a lot more people involved in farming. And then they see the plants on their, by their own eyes, and more are involved in concretely. So is it actually easier to introduce the idea of GMOs to those parts of the world? Can they be sort of the part where you have the acceptance and then bring it from there, instead of thinking the other way around?
I'll turn that around slightly, which is that I've given up trying to persuade people in Europe that GMOs are safe. I don't care anymore. You're all perfectly well fed. No one's going to get, preventable diseases from malnutrition, okay? So you eat your organic food, you stop spraying pesticides, and you fool yourself that you're helping the planet or helping the environment or helping your own health. That's fine. Irritating, but it's not the end of the world. In Africa, it's a bit different, because you can actually point to lives lost in a more direct and more meaningful way. It's a bit like the anti-vaccination movements, and this is why I think the answer to your question is probably no. That even where you can make such a direct link between anti-vaccination movements and child deaths, increase in child deaths from resurgent diseases, it still doesn't persuade people. And it's fairly similar that, I've spoken to a lot of African policymakers, and they say, but in Europe they're rejecting GMOs, so why are you trying to make us Africans have it? Are we some kind of experimental guinea pig? They'll use that argument, or they'll say, well, no, we need to leapfrog industrial and go organic. And by the way, by going organic, that means basically subsistence agriculture. And so you have all of these charitable groups out there, I would say, defending poverty, because they're saying that they like the way that people look, right? Because if you think of the mentality where these industrial, rich country groups come from, they see people in the fields, colourfully dressed, pretty much all women, under the hot sun, with their digging sticks, and they're doing it as it's supposed to be done. They're in contact with the ground. And we in industrial societies feel terribly guilty because we're living in cities, we're out of contact with nature, and so they look at that and they think that's your idyllic past right there in Africa. So that's what we need to defend. We don't want these people driving combine harvesters, or sitting in an air-conditioned cab of a tractor on Facebook. They should be there with their fingers in the soil. But what is the impact of that? That's poverty, right? That's very low levels of productivity. That's deforestation, because these same women have to go and get charcoal from the local forest. It's a political paradigm that you're talking about there, and so it's not just a rejection of GMOs, it's a rejection of hybrid crops, it's a rejection of mechanization, of irrigation, of even of fertilizer as well. So it's a defense of food insecurity, in my view, on the basis of defending food security, food sovereignty rather.
Well, about two years ago, European Parliament made a resolution. It was not a law, but it was about Africa's agriculture. European Parliament recommended Africans to avoid GMOs and practice almost organic agriculture. What do you think? What does this kind of resolution in Europe influence to the Africans?
Yeah, I remember that, and I think that was very damaging. And there was a response from, I would say, more progressive African policymakers who rejected that, and they wrote letters and things. But that was a very colonial piece of European. But the thing is, with the rise of the Green parties and things, so many countries in Europe now, there's no debate about this. It's hegemonic, the Green perspective on GMOs and organic. I recently did a talk in Vienna, and there was about 100 people in the room, and that was the entire Austrian population of pro-GMO, pro-science people in that one room. So they're not going to win votes, and all of their MEPs are going to say the same thing, and that's what happened when that got through Parliament. So it didn't even occur to these people, to these MEPs, that there would be any reason to even debate this issue, because of course GMOs are bad. You don't want African farmers being dominated by Monsanto and having to use more pesticides. I mean, it's obvious. And so the obvious untruths end up having a destructive effect in the real world, because there's this big divide. But that's where the liberal left is on its post-truth side as well.
Thank you firstly for your excellent presentation. I suppose you're right in saying that Europe is a sort of lost cause in that sense, that it's impossible to convince the wider population to approve or accept GMOs as safe and healthy options. However, do you have any idea why the hell did it happen in Europe, of all places, that we have such a vehement anti-GMO population living here? I mean, usually I would imagine that Americans, they're usually more irrational than Europeans. This sort of thinking should take place there. Are there some commercial interests also threatened here, or something else like that?
I think it's to do with the rise of environmentalism. And so when I say my younger self in my early 20s, that was the early stage of when environmentalism was becoming politically significant in Europe. The electoral system in the UK stopped the Green Party becoming a significant force, but where you've got proportional representation in most of these, Germany, Austria, Italy, most of these European countries, when the Greens were getting into power, they would give them the environment, or they would give them energy, because those are the ministries they can have, and you don't really care what happens with the environment, and maybe the Greens will get it right, so just let them do it. And so the Greens actually began to monopolize energy, agriculture, and environmental issues in a way which hasn't had the best of outcomes. I mean, the German Energiewende is a good example as well of what happens when you give a portfolio to the Greens that they have a very strong ideological position on, which is not evidence-based. And so now you have old-growth forests being destroyed for open-cast lignite mines in Germany because they closed down the nuclear power stations. We all know the story, and in many ways that was foreseeable, but not if you believe in the myth of wind turbines and solar will solve all of our problems and we can close down the nuclear first because we've always hated that, and so on. And I think the GMO issue fell into the same kind of category of having the organic. So I think it's very tied with the rise of organic farming and organic eating as well, because even if a lot of people don't buy organic, they all think it's better. Yeah, maybe they can't afford it, or but you won't find anyone who can say anything bad about organic agriculture. So it's become hegemonic. It's not It's not an ideological position which is even seen as ideological anymore, because everybody believes it. It's just truth, except it's wrong.
Over there back.
I don't agree with you when you say that anti-GMO people use the same way of thinking as skeptical people about climate change. Because, in my point of view, scientists who work on climate change, they just try to understand how the world is going, how physical things are moving and stuff. So they try to understand our world. And GMO scientists who work on GMO, in my point of view, they use science in a technology. So GMO is a technology; it's not science, and they use science to make to improve this technology. For me, like the Earth is not a technology, so scientists try to understand the Earth with science, and GMO is a technology, and scientists use science to improve this technology.
Yeah, I used to make that argument to myself when I was trying to explain my own inconsistency in being pro-science on climate and anti-science on GMOs. So I can understand where you're coming from, because I used to make that same excuse to myself, but it's wrong, because science is a way of answering questions. And the empirical question you can ask is, are accumulating greenhouse gases affecting the Earth's climate? And there's theoretical basic physics, right? And there's evidence as well in terms of, I don't know, instrumental readings of temperature, whatever. And on GMOs, of course, on the safety question, and I restrict my discussion on scientific consensus to the safety issue, that is a question you can answer empirically. You can do proteomics. You can look at the compositional analysis of the conventional and the GMO crop. You can characterize the genes, which of course you do anyway because you're putting the genes into there. You know what proteins are going in. You know whether it's allergenic. You can even do animal studies if you believe that's useful. You can even compare epidemiologically between populations who are eating them and populations who don't, which I think is a very, very poor way of doing it, but you could look at that too if you wanted. So that is a question you can address scientifically. And so I say to Greenpeace, all right, you believe there's a scientific consensus on climate change. That's great. Do you believe there's an equivalent scientific consensus on the safety of GMOs? And they say no. And I say, why not? And they say, well, because there's a statement signed by 100 scientists that says that GMOs are unsafe, or that there's no consensus. And I say, well, there's a statement signed by 1,000 scientists that say that climate change is not real. So clearly that's completely inconsistent. But the political questions are different. So there's only certain things that science can answer, but if you're going to reject science on one and defend science on the other, that's still an inconsistent position. So I don't know, do you accept that there's a scientific consensus on GMO safety? You. Yeah, you.
I don't know. I don't inform about science in GMO. I don't know what scientists say on GMO.
Well, it's very easy to look it up. Look at the statements made by the scientific academies. Look at you don't have to perform a whole literature survey. You can look at the meta-analyses which have been done. There's 2 or 3 papers which do that job for you, and look at all of the literature. So you may not know about this, but then you ask me a question which suggests that you either don't know about it or you don't understand it. And that's fine, but you need to be honest with that about yourself.
I'll take my question now. I've always wondered, like that, as a friend of mythology and such things, that they are awfully powerful in communicating stuff. And I've been thinking about that. Why is it the case that it's kind of easier to believe kind of mythological things or the stories or untruths? Is there something that scientists or the communities like us could do better in communicating results, or is it simply a kind of a leap of faith when people just don't believe the evidence and such things? Is it the kind of a religious approach in that sense?
Well, I mean, religions are more than just shared myths. I mean, religions have myths and narratives embedded in them, which is how they make sense and how they get propagated down through the generations. But religions are also about, I mean, originally I think religions came as a way of organizing complex societies through moral belief codes, essentially, so how to behave in every single situation. And for that, they've been, that's why religions arise in just about every society which has complexity. So they're religions are an evolutionary tool that humanity has come up with, evolved. And so yes, that stuff is hardwired into us biologically. So how we as humans derive meaning comes very much through narratives and through storylines. And you can't really tell a scientific story without telling it as part of a narrative. If you just were to put a graph up and with facts and figures, it's meaningless unless it's part of an overall narrative. And the narrative, like you just said about climate change, is, and this is why Greens believe climate change, is because they already have a narrative of humans doing something bad in the world. Industrial humans particularly doing something bad in the world. Mother Earth will surely be badly affected by the way we live in this modern world. And of course, climate change gives evidence for that, because you've got, the big byproducts of all of our fossil fuel combustion doing this to the planetary climate. And so it's easy for Greens to disbelieve GMO safety because it's still about humans doing something bad for the world. So for them, the narrative is reversed, which is where your point was about technology. Well, our intrusive technology is damaging the climate. Our intrusive technology is damaging biology by changing plant or animal genetics. So the reason why Greens would believe one and not believe the other is because then the way they assimilate it in terms of the narrative is different.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think it's more down to the fact that the concrete evidence is just not there yet? When you look at climate change, as you said, there's a lot of evidence out there. You can see it actually happening around you. If you look at the meat industry or the dairy industry, there's a lot of evidence to say now that a lot of that kind of production of that kind of food is actually carcinogenic, actually, in some instances. But is it just a case of like GMO not being mature enough to actually have the evidence for people to go, okay, now I believe it's safe, or now I believe it's unsafe?
Oh, really? 20 years of evidence is more than enough, I would say. Also, your first part of your question, you said climate change, I can believe it because you see it happening all around you. Well, that's anecdote. Actually, you can't see that. Nobody can personally see a change in average temperature over 30 years at a global level. By definition, this is an average global over a long period of time, right? That's the opposite of anecdote. That's empirical data. And only empirical data can really meaningfully address the questions of carcinogenicity. So for that, you need to either look at it at a cellular level, look at the effects of such and such a substance chemically on DNA. You can do it that way, or you can look at it epidemiologically and try and compare different groups, exposed groups. But that's very difficult to do because of all the confounding factors, and we've seen this with radiation as well, radiological protection. Now, obviously, we know that ionizing radiation is a carcinogen. But at what level does it become meaningfully a risk or a threat? And the same goes, I think, for meat. So I think it's probably the case that processed meats and red meats are carcinogenic at some level. How significant that is a risk factor depends on all sorts of other things as well. But for GMOs, there's no evidence at all, and there's not even a common sense reason why there would be a threat. So the belief system just inverts it. Because you see something bad is being done with my pure food, therefore it must be causing cancer. And so the reason, the human reason is inverted in the sense that it's bad, it's got to be bad in some way, you just have to now find the evidence for it. What you really need to be doing is saying, okay, this thing's happening, is there any evidence that it's either bad or good? And so for GMOs, what are you even doing at the molecular biology level? So you're taking a sequence of DNA which codes for a protein, and you're taking it from one organism and putting it in another. Why would that cause cancer in somebody who consumes it? You digest DNA just like anything else. It doesn't matter whether it's recombinant or not. It's just lots of A, T, Ds and Gs, right? A, T, Cs and Gs rather. Why would you even care? Because you've got a pre-existing narrative that says it's impure, and therefore it's likely to be bad, and therefore you must go out and try and find evidence, and torture the data, either epidemiologically with rats or anything else, which is precisely what the anti-GMO professors go and do. And they produce one or two papers, and they dominate the media, and they help undermine the idea that there's any kind of scientific consensus. But it all comes down ultimately to storylines and to these values-based level ideas of purity and such like.
Okay, one more and then...
Okay, why is peak phosphorus so little talked about? because that is going to be a very, very big problem in future.
I don't know. I mean,
That is not your area.
it's not my area, but I have an opinion on it nonetheless. So what's peak in terms of phosphorus is very concentrated deposits in the Earth's crust. There's quite a lot of phosphorus around in the Earth system. And obviously at a biological level you can't substitute it, right? You can't grow plants without phosphorus. It's an essential part of the biology of living organisms. But what you're talking about probably is going a bit lower down the scale thermodynamically and having less access to very cheap phosphorus which you can just throw all over the fields. And we can really improve the amount of the degree to which phosphorus is recycled in the system. Throwing it away causes eutrophication and is affecting the Baltic and just about every marine environment where you've got fertilizer runoff and so on and so forth. So I'm not convinced that it's a particularly imminent problem, but it's one that we ought to look at anyway, because spreading phosphorus around in the environment isn't good for biodiversity as much as anything else.
Okay.
Great, everyone's happy. Good.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. So before we